Welcome back. I'm Jonathan Capehart, in for Melissa Harris Perry. This week, President Obama took the wheel and began turning it away from nearly 3 decades of U.S. policy on drug sentencing with this Wednesday's announcement from the Justice Department.
I'm pleased to announce a Department of Justice initiative to encourage qualified federal inmates to petition to have their sentences commuted or reduced by the President of the United States.
But pause with me for a moment, because in order to understand the new direction in which the President is taking us, I need to take you back to the moment another president set us along our current course. This is October 27, 1986, the day President Ronald Reagan signed a law called the Anti-Drug Abuse Act. This law marked the first significant piece of legislation to formalize America's war on drugs and appropriated $1.7 billion for new prisons, drug education, and treatment. And that's $1.7 billion in 1986 money, so you know that's a lot of money. But the law's most lasting legacy was the creation of a 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between powder and crack cocaine. It meant, despite the fact that cocaine and crack are pharmacologically identical, it took 100 times more cocaine than crack to trigger the same mandatory prison sentence. The law also imposed mandatory minimum sentences that took sentencing decisions out of the hands of judges and forced them to put low-level drug offenders behind bars for years. And today, 27 years later, we are still living with the consequences of what that drug war has wrought. An explosion in the federal prison population from about 24,000 in 1980 to more than 200,000 by 2009, an increase of more than 700%. By 2009, drug offenders comprised more than half of the total population of federal inmates, many of whom were subject to mandatory minimum sentences. The new tough-on-crime policy shift was also accompanied by profound racial inequities in incarceration rates for drug crimes. Despite comparable rates of drug possession and sales, African Americans and Latinos are far more likely than white Americans to become criminalized and to serve longer sentences for drug offenses. In 2010, President Obama began taking the first major deviation away from the policies that created those disparities when he signed the Fair Sentencing Act. That law reduced the disparity in the amount of cocaine versus crack required to trigger the mandatory minimum from 100-to-1 to 18-to-1. And it eliminated the mandatory minimums for simple crack possession, which brings me back to Wednesday's announcement and the Obama administration's sharp turn to bring justice to the casualties of the war on drugs. In what the New York Times called a symbolic break from the past, the Justice Department has extended the opportunity for federal offenders to be released from prison early if they meet a strict set of guidelines. Now, it's not going to be easy. The prison gates are by no means being thrown open with convicts pouring out into the streets. It will be quite hard for an inmate to secure early release. In order to move to the front of the line for clemency consideration, inmates must have been in prison at least 10 years and be serving a sentence that would be significantly shorter under current laws. They must be nonviolent, low-level offenders with no history of gang affiliations, violence, or criminal activity, and have demonstrated good behavior during their time in prison. Every inmate will be notified in the coming week of the opportunity for clemency and can request free legal help to prepare their application. And although the Justice Department could not confirm exactly how many would be eligible, the new initiative could mean hundreds, possibly thousands, who were unfairly sentenced could finally finish repaying their debt to society. Joining me now is Glenn Martin, president and founder of Just Leadership USA, which aims to cut U.S. prison population in half by 2030. Dafna Linzer, managing editor of MSNBC.com, who in her previous role at ProPublica authored a crucial series on the Obama administration's clemency operation that led to notable change. Judith Browne Dianis, co-director of the Advancement Project, and Raul Reyes, columnist for USA Today. They're back at the table. Glenn, I want to start with you because this is a major announcement. But as I said, it's not like inmates will apply and be released next week. From a practical standpoint, what's it going to take for this plan to be implemented? And how long before we start seeing some, if any, real changes in the federal prison population?
Let me start by just putting it in further perspective. So 40 years, $1 trillion, 40 million people arrested, and drugs are cheaper and more available than ever before. with a recidivism rate in the federal system of 2/3 over 3 years. I can't think of any other industry that would have such a failure rate and continue to operate, except that we found a way to monetize misery through private prison. So let's start there and put it in perspective. Every time you read a criteria, what it takes for a person to even be eligible, the number in my head, we start with 200,000 people in the federal system, just kept shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. The fact that you have to serve 10 years and 10 years with a good disciplinary record, I mean, this is a system that inherently is about punishment. Mother Teresa would do 10 years and probably not come out without a disciplinary record.
So that's incredible perspective. Left me speechless.
That's so true, because just think about it. If you were someone put in prison for this type of crime with this disproportionate sentence, you are utterly hopeless. You have truly nothing to lose. So it's like you said, it's almost the human condition that maybe you get involved in violence, or that it drives you to it. And also, when we speak about the war on drugs, it's important. You touched on it with the racial disparities. It's a war on drugs with an asterisk, because it's a war on drugs for poor communities. It's a war on drugs in communities of color. It's not a war on drugs, and it was not a war on drugs for the whole country.
I think a few important things about this is, one is that the president said in the State of the Union that he was going to start to use the power of the pen. And so it's important that he actually took this step, but also important because it's signaling all of the work that so many folks like you, Glenn, have done, and the ACLU, to move away from a punishment nation, and also to make sure that we have these unlikely allies, right, which in the Republican and the GOP party, which are really about like the money part. They don't want to keep putting out that money. But for those of us who do civil rights work, it's important because we know who this hits the hardest. We know that communities of color are over-policed, are over-arrested, are over-prosecuted, and therefore disproportionately in the system.
You know, we can't have this conversation without talking about just how risky this move is politically for the president. And, you know, during the 1980s and the 1990s, a move like this would have gotten the president just completely, you know, killed by the opposition. And of course, we can't talk about this until we take a look at the ad that derailed Michael Dukakis's presidential campaign, as a reminder of the political consequences of supporting a policy that released inmates from prison. Let's show that very famous ad.
Dukakis not only opposes the death penalty, he allowed first-degree murderers to have weekend passes from prison. One was Willie Horton, who murdered a boy in a robbery, stabbing him 19 times. Despite a life sentence, Horton received 10 weekend passes from prison. Horton fled, kidnapped a young couple, stabbing the man and repeatedly raping his girlfriend. Weekend prison passes. Dukakis on crime.
That killed Michael Dukakis in the presidential election. So what's changed since then?
So that was an incredibly effective ad that everyone thinks about when they think about clemency, right? Except that, you know, name me a person who has been pardoned by a president in the last 20 years other than Mark Rich. I bet none of you can. Or name me a federal inmate whose sentence was commuted who went out and committed a crime after they were finally released from very, very long sentences. Nobody can. And the fact is, the president, I think, in this case, you know, took many steps, I think, along the way, starting in 2010, to kind of lay the groundwork for a lot more bipartisan support, I think, to kind of mitigate some of that political risk. I would say that the steps that they've taken now, even though, as you say, the numbers will be very low for the number of people who will really be eligible right at the beginning based on the criteria, but this is the beginning criteria. That's kind of the way I see it. That doesn't mean that the criteria can't be broadened as the program starts and goes along its way. But I would tell you that after having, you know, done enormous investigative work on the Pardons Office, the people who the president and the Attorney General are interested in commuting, those are exactly the people that the Pardons Office was working overtime to prevent their release. You know,
on that point, because I was going to ask you about that, any reason to think that these folks will be more accurate and more efficient this time around?
I think absolutely. I think, number one, the president coming out and saying what he is interested in seeing and being very public about it, I think already creates a kind of accountability. But beyond that, I would also say bringing in federal public defenders and members of the New York Bar to help people do, you know, process applications. That's a wide open door. And more importantly, I think getting rid of the pardon attorney, as they did this week, was the most important thing that I have seen them do as far as clemency goes in a long time. And that was an absolutely necessary necessary step to clean up that office and bring in a new pardon attorney who has spent her career dedicated to helping the poor and feeding the hungry and sentencing reform.
Real fast, Glenn.
Sure. On the issue of partisanship, let's not forget it was George Bush who talked about this issue in the 2004 State of the Union address, where he recognized that we had over 700,000 people exiting our prison each year, and we needed to essentially do something about that and push Congress to create the Second Chance Act, which has been supported every year since then.
All right, everybody, stay right there. When we come back, he's not a president, but he played one on TV. Can he persuade Congress to side with the real president on sentencing reform?